working with is how to create our shapes, which should be really pretty familiar from our first Illustrator project that we worked with. You can also use the pattern tool, which we use for our pattern assignment. And now I'm just going to do a brief overview of how to build your shapes and how to manipulate them. And then I'm going to talk about something new, which is going to be how to kind of manipulate opacity, blending modes, things like that. So it becomes much less rigid. It becomes more solid, less solid. And we can talk about something called blending mode. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how to create our shapes. So for this shape, pretty simple. I've got a rectangle, um, and then I'm going to use my Pathfinder tool. So I'm going to create a couple circles and maybe play with them. You always want to think about how things are overlapping and what you want that end shape to look like. So I've got shapes that are overlapping. I'm going to go ahead and select all of them. And we can go up to Window, and we're going to go down to Pathfinder. And remember, these function in really specific ways. So I can do unite, which you'll see now it's one solid shape. I could also do minus the front, which looks kind of like Swiss cheese, which that's kind of interesting. I can also do intersect, and that really depends on kind of how you're building that. And then we can also do exclude. So you'll see that one's kind of interesting. So we'll do that one so we can work with some different blending effects. So I'm going to kind of be making my shapes over here. I'm going to be dragging them over here to kind of play with. And then, of course, all the same key commands are the same. So if I want to repeat this, I'm going to hold down Option and click and drag. If I want to change the size of something, I need to make sure that I hold down Shift to scale it down. And then if I don't hold down Shift, you'll see that it'll kind of mess up my proportions, and that never looks very good. So we want to make sure that that is not happening. So maybe instead of these three grouped right here, and you'll notice I'm using my artboard to kind of place things and organize things. You'll notice I've got that big cloud down there. Let me grab this little guy. One thing to keep in mind is that the reason that our layers are color coded is so that we can see where we're working. So you'll notice right now, as I click on any of these big elements, you'll notice that they're red. We can also drag these elements to another layer. And so that's really helpful sometimes if we're doing something quickly and we're like, oh man, that needs to not be on that layer. So you'll notice here I'm on City Elements Large, and you'll see this little square. And if I click and drag that little square, I can take it up to another layer, and you'll notice there it was hidden, but now I can actually see these elements. So I can actually see how they're illuminated in yellow now. So I'm actually going to drag it back down to the red layer, and you'll see it switch back to red. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag this new element that I did. And then you'll also notice the arrangement of our objects really matters. And so you'll see now I've created this kind of cloud-like shape, which is smaller over here, but bigger over here. And my shapes are kind of floating awkwardly in front of it. So we want to remember to work with arrange. So I'm going to go to Object, Arrange, and then I'm just going to say send backwards, or I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to send these objects backwards. So I'm going to go Object, Arrange, send backwards, and I can also use the key command to do that. And now my shapes are kind of floating behind that, and I think that looks a little bit better. So what's nice is you can go through and you can really kind of manipulate these things and play with them as much as you want to. You'll notice I've got a little bit of a glow going on right there, and I'll talk about what that means in just a second. So one of the great things about Illustrator is that you can play with something called blending modes. So what I'm going to do, just so that you can see what it's going to look like, is I'm going to overlap two shapes. And you'll see that they're solid colors. They look pretty like kind of rectilinear, curvilinear. They feel very solid. Instead, I can go through and I can kind of play with how these things are blended with other things. And this will be a lot of fun when we get into color as well. So I'm going to switch from layers, and you'll notice here I've got all my swatches, I've got my layers, here I've got properties. So one of the first things I can go through and I can play with is the opacity. And so I can change the opacity. And actually I'm going to, even though you can't do this really with your Your monochromatic one, I'm going to show you how these colors start to blend, which I get pretty excited about. So you can see here, you'll notice how the two colors are starting to interact. So opacity is one way that you can kind of blend things together. I'm just overlapping two elements. You can use this in so many different ways in your project. So this is just demonstrating what this tool does. Next to that, you'll notice that we can click on opacity. And this is one of my favorite things is you'll notice that right here it says normal. And right next to that are all of our blending modes. These used to be really well used in Photoshop, but now you can use them across Illustrator and InDesign. So and I like to play with these. So there's lots of different ways to play with these. I'm going to darken, and you'll notice that that has kind of like a screen printing effect. I can do multiply. You're not going to see a big difference with that. The way that these work is based on color and then also values. You'll notice that lightens where it overlaps. Um, Color dodge, you're not going to really see a whole lot. Overlay is a really beautiful one, especially if I kind of bring it out here and it has like this really kind of beautiful transparency. Overlay is one of my all-time favorites. I can do soft light, I can do hard light, and you'll notice that sense of transparency. It's letting other objects show through. Now, of course, these are not going to work really for our project. So down here, kind of ignore these, but any of these, as long as they're not changing your swatches and your colors that you're using, is fair game. The other thing that's really nice about this is that you can change the intensity of it and the opacity. So I can actually add overlay and also change opacity as well. And so you'll notice that this feels kind of farther away. It feels like it's floating. These are other ways to work with the idea of atmospheric perspective. So I'm going to bring this back up. And then the other thing to think about is like what's sitting on top of what. So I'm actually going to do something like this. And I'm going to use three colors just so that you guys can see it. I mean, it's going to be a little bit difficult if we don't do that. So I'm going to just use CMYK. All right, so we've got our three things layered together. They're different values. They're different. And actually, we'll leave this one dark. So we'll do this, this, and that. And depending on how you layer them, they're going to function differently. So we'll do darken, which, ooh, look at the magenta on the blue. That's cool. If you're doing triactic, that could be a fun thing to do. Let's see if we go to multiply. That's going to intensify it a little bit. Color burn is not going to work for what we're doing. Lighten is not really going to work for what we're doing. But if we come down to overlay, that's pretty interesting too. So depending on the kind of arrangement of your colors, depending on what you're doing, if we do soft light, and all of this actually really, really super depends. That's really nice on what your background color is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the background out of the way. And you'll notice that our colors are like really vibrant now. So we'll go back here. So the way the blending modes work is they have to function in terms of what is overlapping with what other colors and then also what's happening in the background. So sometimes you might try something and be like, this is not working. Put it on a lighter or darker background just to see like this is pretty fascinating. So any of those things can certainly, I think, be choices. So if we go to overlay, soft lights, there's so many, and then we can also play with the transparency as well. So it's really kind of fun to play with these elements. They add a lot of depth. There's a lot of creativity that you can do with them. And then you can always, if you don't like whatever it is, just put it back to normal. And then put your opacity back to normal, and then you're good to kind of go. So blending modes is one way to kind of play with things. I also, in the demo file, if we come up to atmospheric elements, I turn this on. What I simply did was I made a pattern over here with my pattern tool, and then I filled it with my pattern tool. And then, let's see. Hold on, it helps to label things. All right, so here, if we go to, there we go. All right, so this element, if we go to opacity, this one is set to overlay. So you can play with some really interesting, you'll notice here with darken, you'll see how that texture is just coming up through. So there's so much that you can really kind of play with and enjoy. Like this looks very different than say the overlay option like I was talking about. You'll notice it's not showing up on the white, or sorry, it's not showing up on the yellow because of how light the values are. And this is what the original version looks like. And I'll put it back over so you guys can see it a little bit better. But that's a really nice way with atmospheric elements, maybe making a pattern, maybe making some kind of visual texture, going to opacity, and then going through and just playing with kind of your blending modes and seeing how that works. And of course, if you don't like the intensity, you can also just bring the opacity down as well. You can also layer lots of other things together too. So you can also really play around with like what's above or below in your files. Um, so I've added some extra colors in there, which your monochromatic one will not have, but it gives you a good sense of how to create your files, how to create your layers, how to work with your shapes, and then also how to work with blending modes. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I save. I'm also going to double check that all my swatches are there, and the swatches from today's demo and then also within the demo file are there. Um, and then once I'm ready, I am going to save my file. And so those instructions are going to be listed on saving your file. So if we go here, we're going to export as a JPEG. We're going to make sure that we use artboards. We're going to change our mode and our resolution. And all of these things absolutely have to be set for our critique, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So one of the big things that I talk about is to work within your skill set. So work comfortably, but then also be creative and play with color, play with the blending modes, play with lots of different ways to experiment for your imaginary cities.